Hi class, welcome back to another video. I should congratulate those of you who found all the typos in the last episode. There were more than one. Surprise! Congratulations, Ben and Joyce. You discovered the typos. So same competition is up this time. Discover the typo, because there will probably be some. And how I speak. Okay. Let's move on. So last time we did a video, I finished off with a bit of a teaser to this episode or this video. I'll be discussing the Viking Age very briefly, again in 5 pictures. So let's get started. So behind me, you should see footage from the show Vikings. Now, this footage is supposed to be a recreation of the attack on a place called Lindisfarne. This happened in 793, and it was a raid on the Church of St. Cuthbert. St. Cuthbert was the patron saint of Northumbria, which was a powerful kingdom in what will later become, the United Kingdom. At this time, there were a series of kingdoms vying for power on the English Isles, Northumbria being one of the preeminent ones. So, the patron saint St. Cuthbert was buried at a place called Lindisfarne. It was a monastery essentially, and the Vikings raided. This is a quote from, I think, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for 793. Typically, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is really interested in flights of birds and meteorological patterns, and really sparse on details that are interesting to people. But this one was fun. It quotes, "Immense whirlwinds, flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen in the air," and then probably talks about birds or the weather. Anyways, so that's bad. That's weather actually. Dragons in the air. So this is how the description was for the year 793, and then of course the Vikings sack Lindisfarne. Now they targeted, typically they targeted religious communities because they were very poorly defended. I mean, they have God to defend them. Unfortunately, God didn't provide them with guards or an army, as this recreation might be showing now. I'll pause it before the bloodshed happens. Now, there's another person who comments on the Viking raids in Lindisfarne, a fellow named Alcuin. Alcuin was a Northumbrian scholar who worked in Charlemagne's court. He was kind of helped expand Charlemagne's library. So Alcuin wrote, "The Church of St. Cuthbert is splattered with blood of the priests of God." So pretty nasty stuff. This is really the first, the raid on Lindisfarne is the first real well-documented appearance of Vikings on the world stage. So we'll talk about that next, the world stage. Okay, picture number 2. It's actually a drawing using special effects. You can see it should appear right there. So this is a map of Europe from, now. Anyways, so why did the Viking expansion even happen? I kind of alluded to this when we were talking about Charlemagne's expansion into Saxony. This is Saxony right there. So essentially what happens is you have a number of factors causing the Viking expansion. The one I alluded to last week was centralization. Increasing centralization by Viking lords over their lands led some people to be either rebel or be pushed off their lands altogether. Now those people who were pushed off their lands had to take up some sort of profession. Many took up trade. Now when we discuss the Vikings and when popular culture looks at them, they focus on the salacious kind of violent parts of Vikings, and that is the process of raiding. The term Viking actually is a profession. It's to go a Viking, which means to go raiding. The better label for these people would be Norsemen or Danemen rather than Vikings. because that's just a small profession, a small cadre of the people who are actually the Norsemen. So, why else would they go? Why else would they expand? There was a warming, a global warming at this time, causing a slight shift in how people were cultivating their land, and that, in combination with centralization, resulted in large landowners kind of expanding their control. Also, the need for people to cultivate that land that would have done that, slaves essentially. So many Viking traders were actually slavers. So that's part of the reason why this happened. Now, the expansion went a little bit like this. Here's Norway, here's Sweden, you've got Denmark there. Your attack on Lindisfarne happens right here. There's Lindisfarne right there. And I'm just going to do this without watching because I'm that confident that I can draw on this without drawing on my child's walls. So then they went this way. They found the rivers of France. They went along the rivers, and the next thing that I will be discussing is their boats, because the boats enabled the Vikings to travel deeply inland to along a lot of the river courses of Europe. So they went on the Seine, the river in the south, the Rhone. Sure, check that. I'm sure it will come up right here. Okay, and then of course they went into the Mediterranean, into the south. They also went up into the Black Sea through the Mediterranean, and also through the deep rivers like the Volga, the Dnieper, and so on in Russia, founding Kiev right there. No, but founding Kiev and Novgorod right there, and also going to Constantinople right there. Okay. How did they do it? They did it with cool ships. Here's a picture. This is a picture of a ship. I'll put the name there because I don't remember. That has been reconstructed. It's really cool. I'll also put a link to the website because the guys who rebuilt this took it across the Atlantic to New York. So that's neat. Anyways, these ships were amazing. Here's a few stats, which I need to refer to a sheet because I don't remember this. They're 35 meters long, 8 meters wide. They had a mass of 24 meters. Their top speed would be about 14 knots. Along each side would be 25 pairs of oars with 2 people rowing. So you've got a complement of 100 people on these ships. Those people would be if it's going to trade, they'd be traders. If it's going to raid, they'd be Vikings. Maybe they're both sometimes. What's really cool and innovative about these ships is the fir, the Douglas fir that they used to build them was very flexible. They also cut their strips in very, very long strips and overlapped the floorboards of these ships. I'm sure there's a technical term for that. It made them very flexible. They were also had a very shallow draft, which means that they could go both in the ocean but also upriver, which is really important if you're trying to get deep into the interior of Europe, which has a lot of passable rivers. They had a steerboard on the right side. It's where we get the term starboard from. Steerboard, starboard, right side of the ship. And what else? They had a keel that could be inserted when they're in the ocean and then removed when going up rivers, thus improving the stability when out at sea dealing with large waves. So that's essentially how the Vikings were able to get deep into this heart of Europe. In response to this, many Europeans discovered quickly that to halt Viking progress, they'd build bridges. The French did this as Bjorn Ironside, after his raid on Paris, they decided to build a whole bunch of bridges along the Seine, and they actually made these almost fortresses. So they're reinforced bridges, which is just an incredibly practical concept, but also really cool if you think about a bridge that's also a castle. Russia. It takes its name from Rus. Now the Rus if some scholars, they really debate about where the origins of this word comes from, this name, but there is some consensus that it might mean the people who row or those who row. So in that case, the Rus, they might have been Vikings, and they were, because the Kievan Rus and the Novgorodi Rus were Vikings who went up the rivers of Russia and essentially established Novgorod and Kiev. Now, in particular, one of the Kievan Rus is of note, because he's the first that converted to Orthodox Christianity. This fella named Vladimir the Great, he's experienced a little bit of a resurgence in Russia as of late, might be the name. Anyways, Vladimir. So Vladimir basically, he was a Kievan Rus out for glory. He went down to Miklidard. I am pronouncing that correctly, I'm sure. Miklidard was a name for Constantinople, and the name meant the big farm, the big market. So that's what the Kievan Rus, the Vikings, called it. So Vladimir I goes down to Russia, down to Constantinople. They seize the city. The city essentially bribes him and offers him conversion to Christianity. In return, he would be able to operate within the city, and his soldiers would later be operated as the elite guard of the emperor. These are the famed Varangian Guard. Now, he was given three options actually for conversion. So the three options were Judaism was very popular at the time. Well, actually, it wasn't really popular at the time, but it was one of the options that he was offered of the monotheistic religions. Islam was the other, and Christianity was the third. When he looked at Judaism, there were certain rites that, as a pagan, he had not undergone, that most Jewish boys undergo when they're young. He didn't really see that as something he wanted to do, so he threw out that option rather quickly. The Muslims were offered a very compelling narrative and very wide group of followers. However, Islam bans consumption of alcohol, and the Kievan Rus, that wasn't really something that was an option for them, given their consumption of mead and other stereotypes. So Christianity offered basically the best option for him, which is a large group of followers, great history going back that would lend credibility to his rule. So that's kind of the story. This is a legend of the three options that Vladimir had. So he converts and later leads or helps the Varangian Guard. He goes back to Kiev, and of course, as we discovered with Clovis, when your leader converts, so do all of you. So the last picture that we have is the Bayeux Tapestry. Now this is fast forwarding a little bit in the Viking Age, but it's important. So the Bayeux Tapestry is one of our essential sources for the events of 1066 and the emergence of Norman rule in England. But it really requires us to go back a little bit. This picture should be of William the Conqueror or William Duke of Normandy on his horse or sitting on a throne or something. Maybe it's Harold Godwinson. I should find those pictures before I make these videos. Anyways, essentially you have this location in northern France called Normandy. It's named after the Normans, or the Norsemen, Vikings. So essentially what happened is, if you go back to around the 900s, late 800s, northern France was subject to many Viking raids. Central authority had declined under some weak leadership in France. And so the Vikings took advantage of that. Also, you had the emergence of Athelstan in England, who was a very strong ruler. So they looked at northern France as an easier place to raid than, say, England. Now, in 911, there was a king of France named Charles the Simple. He wasn't simple, he was just straightforward, but names are strange. Anyways, so Charles the Simple proposed a deal to a Norseman named Rollo. And he told Rollo that he would offer him a large chunk of land, what later becomes Normandy, in return for the Vikings settling down there and operating as like a buffer state between other Vikings and the Kingdom of France. They would be dukes, but they would be subject to the King of France. This is actually the West Franks, technically, because France is not fully united at that time, but that's not something we need to get into now. So Rollo takes his offer. Now, why would he offer that land to Rollo? In the past, the typical process for dealing with Vikings, aside from, sticking sharp weapons into them and hoping that they go away, was to pay them money. This is called a Danegeld. The Anglo-Saxons did this. The Franks did this. Many rulers at that time did this. Even Vikings did it with each other. So the Danegeld was one option to deal with your enemy, basically to pay them off to go raid somewhere else. This was becoming very costly for the West Franks. So Charles the Simple decided that instead he would offer them land and they could serve as a buffer state. This buffer state becomes Normandy. Now, back to the Bayeux Tapestry. The Bayeux Tapestry chronicles the point at which Rollo's ancestors, in this case Duke William, where they essentially make a deal with the sick King of England, a guy named Edward the Confessor, and his leading nobles, a guy named Harold Godwinson, and essentially chronicles how the Normans eventually become the rulers of England and essentially bring in a conglomerate French Norseman culture to the Anglo-Saxon culture. That is something we're actually going to get into next week. You see what I did there? Last week I finished with a Saxon and then we've transitioned into talking about Vikings. Well, here's your teaser for next week when we're going to discuss the what happens on the English Isles from the departure of Rome all the way up to the arrival of the Normans. Stay tuned.